During this sermon, I'll be reading some verses from Genesis chapter 24 and 25, and I'll begin by reading verses 1 to 9 of chapter 24. Abraham was now very old, and the Lord had blessed him in every way. He said to the senior servant in his household, the one in charge of all that he had, "Put your hand under my thigh. I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I am living, but will go to my country and my own relatives, and get a wife for my son Isaac." The servant asked him, "What if the woman is unwilling to come back with me to this land? Shall I then take your son back to the country you came from?" "Make sure that you do not take my son back there," Abraham said. "The Lord, the God of heaven, who brought me out of my father's household and my native land, and who spoke to me and promised me on oath, saying, 'To your offspring I will give this land,' He will send His angel before you, so that you can get a wife for my son from there. If the woman is unwilling to come back with you, then you will be released from this oath of mine. Only do not take my son back there." So the servant put his hand under the thigh of his master Abraham, and swore an oath to him concerning this matter. Your mission, should you choose to accept it. I wonder if you can recognize where that quote is taken from. Your mission, should you choose to accept it. Well, it's a much repeated line in every Mission Impossible film. Basically, if you've not seen the film, in each film, Agent Hunt is called out of retirement. He's called out of retirement because the future of the world is at stake. And so the IMF recruit their best agent, Ethan Hunt, because this mission is the most important mission in the world. We see a similar plot line happening at the beginning of chapter 24. Abraham's near to retiring servant is given a mission. Abraham chooses his best servant, the one in charge of all that he had, because the mission is that important. And what is this mission? Verse 4. To go to my country and my own relative and get a wife for my son Isaac. Now, at first glance, this doesn't sound like the most important, high-stake mission in the world. None of us are going to lose any sleep if the servant fails. But what you and I need to understand is this. God had given Abraham a very specific promise. This promise included Abraham being blessed. He was leaving behind his old way of life to become one of God's people, because God promised that it would be worth it. This promise included Abraham being blessed and Abraham's family being blessed. They would be God's people in God's land and enjoy God's blessing forever. This promise included all the world being blessed. Abraham's family were to invite others to become God's people too. But if Abraham's son, Isaac, had no wife, and as a result had no children and no family, then, well, firstly, God had lied. There was no future to look forward to. These promises depended on Abraham's family line continuing. God had lied, and, two, Abraham had wasted his time, choosing to trust God only to be let down. So though this servant's mission might not seem the most pulse-racing, edge-of-your-seat, life-changing mission in the world, it actually, to Abraham, was. For the stakes of this mission were and still are extremely high. If Abraham's family continues, if Isaac gets a wife, has a son, and the family grows, well, God is faithful. Conclusion: God's promises are also worth trusting by you and me. But if Abraham's family doesn't grow, If Isaac has no wife, has no son, has no family, well, God is not faithful. Conclusion: if you're currently trusting God's promises, or even considering trusting God's promises, well, you're wasting your time. The outcome of this story is highly relevant, for our mission, our calling, is to live trusting God's promises, living in such a way that might seem foolish if God were not faithful to His word. If God is not faithful, well, prayer is pointless. Serving God, it's a waste of time. Evangelism, well, it's false advertising. If God is not faithful, then if you're looking forward to eternity, well, you're setting yourself up for massive disappointment. The mission, to trust God and live a life based on His promises, that is the mission. But should you choose to accept it? This is exactly the issue Abraham's servant began to debate. Reading Genesis chapter 24, verse 10. Then the servant left, taking with him 10 of his master's camels, loaded with all kinds of goods, with all kind of good things from his master. He set out for Aram Nahim, and made his way to the town of Nahor. He had the camels kneel down before the well outside the town. It was toward evening, the time when the women go out to draw water. Then he prayed, Lord God of my master Abraham, make me successful today, and show kindness to my master. See, I am standing before this spring, and the daughters of this town's people are coming out to draw water. May it be that when I say to a young woman, Please let down your jar that I may have a drink, and she says, Drink, and I'll water your camels too. Let her be the one you have chosen for your servant Isaac. By this I will know that you have chosen. By this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master. Here we meet Abraham's servant debating if God would prove faithful to His word. Note that he's still debating after witnessing all the examples of God's faithfulness in the past. God had proved faithful to Abraham many times before, and Abraham's senior servant had likely witnessed these examples firsthand. And yet, he was still debating. Note also that he'd enough faith to set off on this journey. But when he arrived at his destination, doubts still niggled in the back of his mind. It just goes to show that even the most senior of God's people debate God's faithfulness. Though God has given us enough evidence to have faith, God has not given us enough evidence to do without faith. At every step of the journey, faith is required. To keep going as a Christian throughout your entire life, faith is essential. And so, to help him keep going during his time of questioning, the servant asks for evidence. God, if you are faithful, if you are going to provide Isaac with a wife, may you reveal her to me by getting her to offer me and my camels a drink. The servant here is asking for a boatload of evidence. I mean, it's one thing to say to God, God, show me my future spouse by having them buy me a drink at the bar. That's one thing. But it's quite another thing to say to God, God, show me my future spouse by having them buy everybody in the pub a 2-litre bottle of wine. And yet, this is exactly what the servant is asking for. For the servant asks God to show him Isaac's future spouse by her getting him a drink and watering all 10 of his camels. Now remember, these camels had walked over 600 miles over a period of approximately 4 weeks, and so their petrol tank would have been empty. 10 camels, plus 100 litres of water each to refuel them, equals 10,000 litres of water. And the servant asked God to show him one woman with one water jar who would be willing to fill these 10 bone-dry camels up to the brim. That's an extremely specific, generous woman that he's asked seeking to be Isaac's wife. I'll now read verses 15 to 21. Sorry, I've just lost my place. One moment. Before he had finished praying, Rebekah came out with her jar on her shoulder. She was the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah, who was the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor. The woman was very beautiful, a virgin. No man had ever slept with her. She went down to the spring, filled her jar, and came up again. The servant hurried to meet her and said, "Please give me a little water from your jar." "Drink, my lord," she said, and quickly lowered the jar to her hands and gave him a drink. After she had given him a drink, she said, "I'll draw water for your camels too, until they have had enough to drink." So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough, ran back to the well to draw more water, and drew enough to fill for all his camels. Without saying a word, the man watched her closely to learn whether or not the Lord had made his journey successful. God provides the servant with a boatload of evidence, as Rebekah waters all 10 of the servant's thirsty camels. God shows himself faithful. The servant now knows he's on the right path. God's trustworthiness is no longer up for debate. But what about you? And what about me? When we find ourselves debating God's faithfulness, should we do the same? Well, as a side note, it needs to be said that this is not the way the Bible encourages us to make practical decisions. For example, "God, if you want me to do this, show me such and such a sign." God has given us all Scripture so that we might be thoroughly equipped for every good work. 2 Timothy chapter 3. We're to make decisions based on what Scripture says, not based on signs or omens or fleeces. Also, it needs to be said that this is not the way the Bible encourages us to make commitment decisions. For example, "God, if you're there, send me 5 angels doing the Macarena right now." Jesus, at one time, he was with the Pharisees, and some of the Pharisees and teachers of the law said to Jesus, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." Jesus answered, "A wicked and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of Jonah." Jesus explained that an excessive seeking of signs is often a symptom of unbelief, not belief. An excessive seeking of signs is often a symptom of an unwillingness to believe the evidence that's already been given. But though we aren't to imitate the actions of Abraham's servant, the conclusion is still the same. God has given us sufficient evidence to encourage belief, though not do without it. And God's faithfulness is shown by him having all the moving parts in place. For time's sake, I'll only be touching on the second, how God demonstrates his faithfulness. I don't have time to go through all the evidence that is there to encourage belief. You can find that in other places. But for the moment, let's think about God's faithfulness. Well, I'm sure you've all had an electrical appliance that you nicknamed Old Faithful. Old Faithful toaster, Old Faithful microwave, Old Faithful car, TV, etc. It's that item, that gadget that you had for decades, but eventually, after many years of service, it had to be replaced. And so you did replace it, but new Old Faithful is nothing like Old Faithful. You had to take new Old Faithful back to the shop after a week. A few months later, only half of its functions continued to work. it only lasted half as long as Old Faithful, and so, within a very short time, new Old Faithful was in the bin. And at the end of it all, you said, they don't make 'em like they used to. And you were right. They don't make them like they used to. Your Old Faithful car consisted of engine, tires, and brakes. And when you have so few moving parts, there's very little that can go wrong. But new Old Faithful consists of engine, brakes, tires, power steering, aircon, central locking, Bluetooth, sat-nav, parking camera, etc., etc. If any one of these moving parts fails, often the whole thing falls apart. You know, your Old Faithful microwave consisted of a glass turntable and a knob. But new Old Faithful microwave, well, it has 1,000,001 different functions, and also doubles up as a grill, an oven, and a karaoke machine. If any one of these moving parts fails, the whole thing falls apart. Now Abraham's servant knew that his mission's success depended on many moving parts. He had to find a woman from a certain tribe, who was available, who would be willing to leave everything behind for a man she'd never met, and Isaac would have to fall for her instantly. And yet, in chapter 24, we see all these moving parts fall into place. Before he had finished praying, Rebekah came out with her jar on her shoulder. She was the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah, who was the wife of Abraham's brother, Nahor. In other words, she was from the right tribe. Not only that, but the woman was very beautiful. Isaac would fall for her instantly. And she was a virgin, no man had ever slept with her. In other words, she was single. She went down to the spring, filled a jar, and came up again. The servant hurried to meet her and said, "Please give me a little water from your jar." "Drink, my lord," she said, and quickly lowered the jar to her hands and gave him a drink. And she was not only willing to give the servant a drink, but later we learn that she was willing to go back with him and be married to Isaac. God's faithfulness was proved despite all the moving parts that needed to fall into place. And it is in this way that God has proved his faithfulness again and again. Psalm 74. You rule over the day and the night. You created the sun and the moon. You decided where the borders of the earth would be. You made both summer and winter. There are so many moving parts needed to keep life on earth moving. Every sunrise depends on the forces of gravity between everything in our solar system remaining balanced. Every breath you breathe is dependent on the gases in our atmosphere remaining just right. Every tide is dependent on the phases of the moon. Every season, which our food cycle depends on, relies on God's fingers spinning numerous different plates. And God has faithfully kept all these moving parts moving since the very beginning. Luke chapter 24, it says, Jesus said to them, his disciples, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophet, and the Psalms." For Jesus to be the Messiah, he had to fulfill so many Old Testament prophecies, things that God had promised hundreds of years before. The Messiah had to be born to a couple both descended from David, in the town of Bethlehem, and then grow up in Nazareth, then perform a set list of miracles, before dying a very specific death with numerous factors he had no control over falling into place. And yet, God faithfully made sure all these and more moving parts fell into place. These things God had promised hundreds of years before. And God has done this again and again and again. Just think how many moving parts had to fall into place for Joseph to go from being dumped in a well to becoming ruler in Egypt? How many moving parts had to fall into place for the Israelites to go from being slaves in Egypt to entering the promised land? Just think how many moving parts had to fall into place for David, a shepherd, to become king, and then his family line to be preserved till the days of Jesus. Throughout the Bible, God has given promises that depend on numerous factors, numerous events, numerous moving parts, all falling into place. And each time, God has made this happen, proving himself faithful again and again. So if this is new news to you, I'd urge you to look into it. Research the evidence to see if the God spoken of in the Bible is worthy of your trust. If this is familiar news to you, let today's passage act as a well-needed reminder. God is faithful. You are on the right path. Trusting God's promises is always the right choice. But, as we are about to see, faith in God is never easy. Again, I'll read some verses from chapter 24. Then the man bowed down and worshipped the Lord, saying, Praise be to the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not abandoned his kindness and faithfulness to my master. As for me, the Lord has led me on this journey to the house of my master's relative. Then Rebekah and her attendants got ready and mounted the camels and went back with the man. So the servant took Rebekah and left. Now Isaac had come from Beer Lahai Roi, for he was living in the Negev. He went out to the field one evening to meditate, and as he looked up, he saw camels approaching. Rebekah also looked up and saw Isaac. She got down from her camel and asked the servant, Who is that man in the field coming to meet us? He is my master, the servant answered. So she took her veil and covered herself. Then the servant told Isaac all that he had done. Isaac brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah, and he married Rebekah, so she became his wife, and he loved her. And Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. This reads like the last scene in a romantic comedy. Together at last, Hugh Grant and Julia Roberts walk hand in hand into the horizon and spend their first night together. We fade to black. The words 9 months later appear on the screen. And our final image in this romantic comedy is of the couple holding their newborn child. But despite both Isaac and Rebekah probably being convinced of God's faithfulness, this is what happened next. Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean from Padan Aram, and sister of Laban, the Aramean. Presumably, 40-year-old Isaac and Rebekah would be in a hurry to have kids. But 28 days after they stare into each other's eyes, looking forward to their future together, Rebekah and Isaac are staring at disappointment. Rebekah menstruates. She's not pregnant. And this same negative pregnancy test is repeated 260 times over the next 20 years. That's like applying for a job 260 times, only to be rejected repeatedly. That's like writing 260 letters to a friend and never getting a reply. That's like investing 260 months in a project, only for the project never to get off the ground. If God is faithful, why did Isaac and Rebekah have to endure 260 repeated disappointments? If God is faithful, why have you maybe prayed 260 prayers and yet not yet received a clear answer? Why, after 260 minutes Bible reading, are you still so vague and unclear about the direction God wants your life to go in? If God is faithful, why, after 260 weeks of investing in a church, do things seem to be plodding along rather than taking off? Why, after 260 months of being a Christian, is battling doubts, sin, and discouragement still so much of a fight? The answer? I don't know. But one thing I have learned from my study of the passage is this. Chapter 24 is very, very long. I encourage you to read it in full for yourself, and you'll just see how long it is. It's very long. Often the facts are repeated twice. And it does this because to remind us of where our eyes need to be focused. We need to keep reminding ourselves of God's faithfulness in the past. Why? Because if you're living off emotional highs as a Christian, you'll not survive. If you're depending on God sending signs and omens and fleeces every hour, then you'll not last. If you're like relying on your own strength, having all the answers, you'll soon find as a Christian that you're asking questions that you don't have answers to. For all these reasons, your and my mission is to constantly look to God. We can do this by looking at God's past examples of faithfulness. We're 24-hour people. We're massively influenced by how we're currently feeling and what we're currently going through right now. Sometimes we need to remind ourselves that God has been proving himself faithful for longer than our transient circumstances have been in existence. God has been proving himself faithful for longer than our emotions have existed. We need to remind ourselves not only of God's past examples of faithfulness, but also remind ourselves of God's character. It's essential we do this when we feel we've evidence that God doesn't care. We need to look to Jesus as a reminder of God's love, God's faithfulness, and God's compassion. Don't let your feelings and your circumstances have the last word. We can do this through the words of hymns, the teaching of sermons, the testimony of creation. As Paul said in Philippians chapter 4, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Why? Well, not as a distraction from our difficulties, not so that we can pretend that our troubles don't exist. We are to think about such things so that we go back to our difficulties and problems with a whole different perspective and a willingness to be patient and wait. And presumably, the likes of this, by reminding himself of God's past act of faithfulness, Isaac kept praying in the face of one discouragement after another. And Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel. And he prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife, because she was childless. That is, childless for 20 years. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth.